the Global Exchange Show, hosted by Andrae Smith, exclusive to Corp Radio. Tuned to the business frequency.
Welcome to Corp Radio. I'm Andrae Smith, your host for the Business Exchange Show. We chat to founders from all over the world about their businesses, on how they scale and run them while traveling the world. Today we're speaking to Matt Gray, who has traveled to over 120 countries and is the founder of Pangea, a social travel app for digital nomads and solo travelers. Welcome, Matt.
Hello, thanks for having me.
No problem. Well, we've worked together quite a bit, but I want you to just dive in and share with our listeners who haven't heard of Pangea a little bit more about the app and how it got started.
Yeah, so as you said, I've been to over 120 countries. I've spent the last decade of my life traveling. First, professionally, I worked at a global fintech and was involved in sort of a consulting corporate development role for quite some time. So managed teams across India, Indonesia, UK, US, Italy, and was always on the road. And was facing a problem that I think a lot of people who travel face, which was, one, where are all the people that I'm connected to in the world, and where do they have connections? If I was going to be in London for work, who did I know who was going to be in Europe? Who could I meet up with? And then two, given that like wealth of knowledge and people who have traveled all over the place, what are the recommendations that they had for different places? Because there's so much sort of crap out there. And I think we can all agree that when you go somewhere, you always take the recommendation for a restaurant or a bar or a cafe to work from. You always value it if it's from someone you trust, more than something that's randomly on Google reviews or on a blog. And I think that was sort of the genesis for creating Pangea. And over the last sort of 2 years, as I've dived into it fully, applied that same sort of playbook that we had applied at my fintech company prior, which was around consolidation and acquisition of different companies in similar space to create something bigger than the sum of its parts. And that's what we've been doing with Pangea the last couple of months.
Incredible. And you've spoken a bit about the acquisition, and I think this has been a big part of your growth strategy. So talk us a little bit through that and how this became a way to bring a lot of new users in.
Yeah, so Pangea started organically, and we built it up and experimented quite a bit organically. We also studied the space. I mean, I was a prolific traveler for quite some time. I used every other travel app. I didn't particularly want to start a travel app. It's a very tough business, and a lot of companies enter the space and sort of fail for a variety of reasons. So it wasn't necessarily my intention, but selfishly, I wanted this to exist. The other tools that were out there really weren't doing what I wanted them to do and what so many travelers that I met during my time on the road wanted those apps to do. So we started just experimenting with something organically. And once we got to a certain point, once we saw what people were really resonating with in the app, that people were really having these magical moments by having their network on board the platform, by being able to see where people were going, by just like coordinating their schedules, it was unlocking these amazing experiences. And as we got really good feedback from our community organically, we started thinking about growth. And in consumer tech in particular, I think growth is really where people underestimate the challenge. You either spend a lot of money on ads or content or a variety of ways to get the word out. But ultimately, you're looking for, at least we're looking for people who are really sticky and really power users of the platform. So if we create a cool ad on Meta and a bunch of people watch it and download the app, but ultimately they're not travelers, they're not going to stay on the app and they're not going to get value from the app and they're not going to bring value to our community because they're not the people who are moving around the world, who have networks of people who are all over the world. So we really started to think, where are those people? Where are they spending time? And is there sort of an inorganic way to do this? And as we were studying the sort of travel landscape and consumer travel landscape, there are so many apps that I think are created by passionate founders who have traveled, who had a specific pain point, who then try to solve that pain point. And they miss and sort of underestimate the challenge and the problem. Travelers are typically very different types of users and consumers each time they travel. So if I'm traveling for work versus traveling with a community of 20 people from Pangea versus solo versus with my mom versus with my partner, et cetera, I'm a different I have a different set of needs each time. And most travel apps that come out, they solve for one set of needs. So it's like, oh wow, this is really great for planning a bachelor party, but I don't really need that more than once a year when I'm going on a bachelor party with some friends. So there's a lot of churn off of those apps. But what we found is that there's a handful that get really sticky users, but are under engaged and under monetized. And that was sort of our thinking is, what if we applied this consolidation playbook and thought about bringing those platforms, like buy the entire app and get a swath of users that are super aligned to what we're trying to do. And it kind of de-risks your growth strategy, because you're able to see exactly how people are engaging with those other apps before you acquire it and in the diligence process. And then ultimately, you're ultimately acquiring users, but you're acquiring really sticky, high value users who are going to engage and become the right people for your community. And that's done very well for us over the 4 acquisitions that we've done.
Makes a lot of sense. And how many users have you been able to acquire to this point?
We're not disclosing, but 6 figures, and growing quickly. So
Exciting stuff. And every founder kind of gets approached with the fundraising question. So what has been your approach to fundraising, and have you taken that on and started your first round?
Well, I think it's interesting because I was reading an article the other week, and it was about how the fundraising process has almost become this like glorified, sexy thing where it's like the fundraise is the goal, whereas really it's a tool. And I think a lot of founders forget that the funding is a tool to get you from A to B. It's a way to get you from a position where you need more resources in order to get to a place where you can become a viable business. And it's not the objective. The objective is to build a business that makes money and creates value for your investors, whether that's you as a founder or people that you bring in with outside capital. And I think a lot of founders kind of forget that. And I think also the VC community is a bit, there's so much money that's getting thrown at sort of sexy slide decks and ideas. And this has been shifting, of course. I think it's become more challenging to raise the last couple of years in particular, and as more focus is getting put on AI. But for us, it's always been demonstrating value first and being very confident with the approach and the strategy that we're sort of deploying before we scale it. So the analogy I always use, if you're like thinking of, I'm a space guy, like, watching all the space missions. And if you're doing a mission to Mars and you're off by like 1 degree, you're going to end up in like deep space and die. So it's the same sort of idea with a startup. If you are like still getting started, you want to be really confident that when you put the rocket fuel in, like hit go, that you're going to end up at the right place, because you can pivot a little bit and you can obviously change course a little bit. But if you just go the total wrong direction and deploy all your capital that you fundraised with and don't get to a business model or a business that's really scalable, then you're not going to be able to do that again. So I think that would be my advice to most founders. Be very confident in the approach that you take before you deploy your sort of round, before you raise your round and deploy your round, because if you're not going to get another chance to do it. And yeah, I think a lot of founders miss that.
Yeah, for sure. And just being able to think about a way to allocate those funds within the business. How do you look at that? Is it in terms of growing users or doing it to get more investors? What type of approach do you take for that?
So kind of similarly, we've tried to. So we did raise a round. We did our pre-seed, and we've sort of continued to hit a bunch of the same private investors that we've have been involved from the beginning. But we haven't done a super loud, hey, we raised this massive seed. Like we haven't done any sort of super loud fundraise so far. Again, because we're trying to thread the needle and figure out, okay, how in a space where like hundreds of other companies and travel apps have failed, how are we going to get this right? And what are the things that we can test quickly and cheaply to figure out what works and what doesn't work? And then the ones that work, sort of double down on and invest more money in and really scale up. So for us, that's been really focusing mostly on product. Obviously, I think early stage and in any network sort of setting, you need enough of a community, enough of a user base in order to test stuff. If you've got, our whole app is that you can keep track of where your friends are and where the community is around the world. If you only have 10 users on the platform, it's going to be a pretty crappy experience, no matter how good the UX and how good the product is. But once you get to sort of 10,000, 50,000, 100,000 users, you don't need more users to test and validate that your business is working. You don't need more users to validate that, like what's working, what's not working. And I think as we've been testing, we've really been focusing on what are people going to use like repeatedly in the app, what's going to keep them there. Because it's great if they download it, it's great if they open it. If they don't stay there, they're not going to be a long-term sort of value add user. What are the things that sort of really drive retention? So, okay, once users do these few things, they're not going to leave our app. They're going to keep coming back. Those sort of retention anchors. And then, yeah, how do we intelligently grow? If we were going to deploy $1 million of marketing budget, should we put it on, A, B, or C? And trying to just test and doing a lot of experimentation. And most of that work for us has been focusing on the product, building the product. We have a great engineering team. We've been doing a lot of experimentation with AI, not only in the development process to just sort of speed up and make things as efficient as possible. We can't like vibe code an app, contrary to what you might be reading. You need like solid engineers to be thinking about it. But there are, of course, ways that AI can rapidly increase the velocity of your engineering. So we've been doing a lot of that. And then also thinking about within the travel space and as capabilities within Pangea, what are the things where AI can be really value add as an end user? This is another sort of pitfall I've seen with other travel app founders. They start an AI company and it's a glorified wrapper on top of ChatGPT. And it's like, okay, well, what are you really building? What are you really doing? Why is someone going to keep using your app once they forgot what its name was? And, you can put a lot of money into marketing, get a lot of people to start using it, but ultimately, why are they going to come back to your app? And we've got a really exciting sort of beta launch of our first set of AI capabilities. And these are all things that, as a traveler, are things that I love having in Pangea and things that, Chat or Claude can't do on their own. We're built on top of those models. We haven't reinvented the models, but we've got a swath of proprietary data and a lot of great tuning from our community of sort of expert travelers that I think is really value add.
Great. And I think for founders who are looking to start raising capital, what would you say they should look for first when they get into this process?
I think, two things. One, you need a really great story, a solid idea, and good business model. If you don't have that, no one's going to invest in you. Or maybe you can get someone to invest in you, but it's not going to be sort of the right investors who are going to support and help you get to, as a founder, your goal is to build something, generally build a company, build a business. And if you don't have that fundamentals, then I think you need to continue to look and figure out how to find something that works. And then it's really just about having huge amount of conviction in yourself and your ability to execute on your vision. And for me, as a traveler, I genuinely know travel. I've spent 10 years traveling nonstop. I traveled for work. I know how to use points and miles. I, have backpacked. I've done sort of every type of travel that there is. And I understand that it's not a simple problem and there's not some magic bullet that's going to solve this like massive category. There's a 1,000 mini problems that have to come together. So I think really understanding a space and a niche is really useful. I've met a lot of founders who I think just jump into like entrepreneurship because they're like, oh, cool, I'll just raise a bunch of capital and it's like a fun little job. And it's like, it could not be further from the truth. I think you need to have a really sort of solid niche and what I always refer to as founder market fit. Why are you the person to solve this problem versus anyone else out there? So find that. And then the second piece for me has been all about sort of network. So I've had so many conversations with so many people. And that started with me reaching out to sort of everyone I ever worked with, people I grew up with, just like, who do you know in the startup community? Like, oh, cool, there's this person in like biotech, like super unrelated to me, but you start having the conversation, you start sharing your vision, sharing your idea, and all of those conversations generally open doors and lead you to sort of other people in the space, other people who are interesting. And you get a lot of different opinions. You get a lot of people to say, oh, that's really interesting. It reminds me of this random other business that did this and this for like retail. And oh, that could be an interesting sort of thing that we could add to travel. So for me, it's been 2 years of doing that process and networking with the full space. Also, as someone with a fintech background and an M&A background, I'm a consumer traveler, but I didn't understand the travel business. So I went to a lot of different events, a lot of different sort of community things, and have really tapped into all of the most prolific travelers in the space, all of the other companies and other founders and other apps. And I think my last sort of piece of advice is just, I mean, it's a kind of fundraising, but also just kind of how to succeed in any business. I am of the mindset that you should always be super collaborative with partners and with other people in the space. I think there's two ways to look at it, either abundance or scarcity. And I always, I've met other travel app founders and they're very guarded and they're very scared and they've got like 5,000 users. And I'm like, there's 500 million travelers a year and it's a like multi-trillion-dollar market. There is plenty of pie to go around. And if you can find interesting ways to partner with people, I think there's ways to sort of elevate yourself as a brand and accelerate yourself as a company. So all of those together, I think just help you get into a really strong position where then you don't necessarily need the capital. You've got a pretty solid foundation. You've got investors who are going to be excited about that and excited about investing in your business.
And I'm sure organically those types of investments start rolling in as you grow your network and more opportunities through collaborations come in. So it's kind of a bit of a snowball effect if you start the process.
It can be. And I think, that running around is a huge amount of effort. It's like a huge amount of time and focus and follow-ups and questions. And, it'll beat you up for sure. You'll get a lot of no's. So definitely don't be intentional with when you do it, and then also be intentional about sort of the time. If you're trying to run a major release or do some major launch and you're also running a fundraise at the same time, you're going to do both badly. So as a founder, if you're also really involved in the business, just be mindful that when you're running the fundraise, you're not going to be 80%, 90% of your time is going to go to the fundraise. So the business needs to be in a point where it can either like operate without you, or you've thought and scheduled your milestones and things around the fact that you need to get the fundraising done. And obviously certain businesses, you need funding in order to get off the ground. But I would, in the same vein, really think about how much capital do you need to get from where you are to where you need to go, so you're not constantly fundraising. Because if you're always on the hamster wheel of trying to like, oh, cool, we raised this money, we've got 6 months, then we're going to raise more money, you're actually always going to be fundraising, because like time goes much quicker than you realize, and things generally take much longer than you hope they'll take. Most founders are optimists, and I think we all are like, oh, cool, we'll just build this and this and this, and then it's like, oh shit, it's going to take a bit longer than we realized. So definitely, plan and raise the right amount so you have enough runway, and probably more than enough runway to get from where you are to where you need to go, so you're not then having to constantly be fundraising. Because if you're a CEO and a founder, you should be focusing on solving the problem, not focusing on convincing someone to give you capital, which is ultimately just a tool to help you solve the problem.
Very good advice. Yeah, I'm sure anyone listening is really going to apply that. And we spoke about the acquisitions earlier. I'm sure there are some founders listening who are thinking about using that for their growth strategy, but approaching different companies and kind of understanding what type of company would be worth it in terms of acquisition, that's a question that they might face. So how would you advise them in that situation?
Well, I think it's definitely not a strategy that most use. I think there's my background and having spent so much time in that space. We have excellent advisors who, and a lot of just embedded knowledge on how do we get the diligence process done, how do we get the paperwork done, how do we get all of these things. Where if you're starting from scratch and you don't have that, I wouldn't necessarily recommend just going. It's obviously learnable, anything is, but there's a lot of nuance to it, and you don't necessarily want to get too distracted there. But for us, our general thesis with the acquisitions are what value is it bringing to us as a company? And is it a size at which we're ready to digest it? So for example, if you're an early startup and you've got a platform with 1,000 users and you bought Facebook, hypothetically, that probably wouldn't work very well because you're not going to be able to digest all the complexity that they have as a business. So the way we sort of rolled out our strategy, we've done 4 acquisitions so far. We started very close to our core focus. So Pangea, at its core, it's a way to share your travel schedule, your plans with your community. There were 2 other apps in the digital nomad space that were doing sort of similar things. We had a lot of users who had friends on all of these apps. It was very logical because the problem that they were solving was identical. The way we were solving was a little bit different, and the origin stories were all different. And I have a lot of respect for the founders of all 3 businesses. But they were very easy to digest because it was very simply moving the users onto Pangea, moving their trips and travel plans onto Pangea. There was nothing, sort of no gap between what we offered and what they offered. Again, some nuance to how it was done or what the UI looked like, but ultimately very easy to integrate. So I think you always want to be thinking ahead of, okay, cool, I buy this company. What am I going to do with the asset that I'm getting? And then the second is we looked, and as sort of a product nerd, and the other hat I wear at Ion was I ran a product team for 5 years, and built up this sort of community consumer platform that we rolled out to all of our acquired entities. I think I looked at what is the value of the user base that we're getting? Because great, an app has 1 million users. Well, if they haven't used the platform in 3 years, who cares? They're literally dead users. It doesn't add any value. So I looked line by line through the database and did a whole lot of analytics. We've got some really great AI tools we've built to help with this. Which of these users can I reasonably and honestly assume are going to get excited about Pangea and activate on Pangea? If they've shared a bunch of their 2026 travel plans with their friends and, Overlap or Nomadigo, those are the 2 first companies we did, there's a pretty high likelihood that they'll still be interested. They're still traveling. They're still going to be interested in sharing plans with people in Pangea once we bring them onto the platform. If they haven't added a trip since 2021, they're probably not traveling anymore, and they're probably not going to care one way or the other about Pangea. So while you're technically getting that user either way, the first one is much more valuable. And then just really thinking through what is that worth to you. And then the second piece is how do you figure out how to make a deal with the founders? And I think what we found in the startup space in general, every founder has a different sort of mission. I think there's a lot of startups that everyone who starts a startup thinks it might be the next Facebook, and then quickly realizes that for 1 million reasons, that's probably not super likely. So you really have to look at where founders are in their own arc. Have they just raised capital? Have they just quit their job to go all in on that? They're probably not at a place that they're trying to sell their company. If they've been, slogging away for 5 years on something and they've raised their round, they've deployed it, and they've built something of value, but they really haven't found the lift to become the next big thing, it's still valuable to someone who might. And that's, I think, been our niche so far for some of these apps, especially at the beginning, were sort of simple apps where the founders were still wanted to solve the problem, didn't necessarily think that they were going to be able to do it, but wanted to put their chips behind a company that had a lot of potential to take their vision and continue it. And that was certainly Overlap and Nomadigo. And then, I've done some slightly larger acquisitions from that, but starting small and then starting to think about how you ramp up from there.
Yeah, super insightful. I have one last question for you today, Matt. So I just want to find out it's actually kind of 2. So what is one lesson that you can share about fundraising and one lesson about acquiring companies for the listeners today?
Trying to think what I haven't already said.
I'm sure you've already given us like 5 pieces of advice for each of these, but maybe one lesson or one piece of advice that you would say is your top one for each.
I think on fundraising. So on fundraising, I think you want to just be very true to yourself and to why you started the business in the first place. I think there's lots of ways that you can pitch, and I've gotten lots of advice to do this, like, oh, you could like pitch this or that. There's a lot of ways to make money in the world. But ultimately, as a founder, if you're going to take capital and you're going to sort of run with a business, it's going to become what you live and breathe for the next 2 to 5 years after that point. So it needs to be something that excites you. And for me, that's been solving this core problem of travel. But if it's not something that excites you, just because someone's going to write you a check to do something, doesn't mean you necessarily want to do it. So I think be very true to your vision, to the business that you want to build. And if an investor passes on that, they're probably not the right investor for you. And I think the other thing that a lot of my advisors have told me, especially early on, there is so much capital out there. There is so much money that gets invested. There's a shortage of good ideas. And I think a lot of founders sort of come at it from the opposite position where, why would anyone invest in me? Well, because you had the guts to start the company and you have this vision, you have all these great things, you're one of a kind. And I think founders need to remember that as they're sort of having these conversations. You're going to have tons of people pass on your company, but ultimately, if you find the person and the investor who's going to be excited about it, that's who you're really looking for. And you don't want a bad match the same way you don't want to sort of bad match in a job offer. You don't want a bad match in a relationship. Whoever invests in your company is hopefully someone who you're going to partner with and build a relationship with. And you want to make sure that is the right fit. So yeah, it's corny, but be true to yourself and just like sell the vision that you actually are going to build, because that will attract the right person, the right partner in the end.
Great. Well, it's been incredible having you on this show today, Matt. If anyone wants to go check out Pangea, where can they do that?
The Pangea.app on socials, and that's our website as well. We also just launched Pangea Trips on Instagram, so we're excited about that. Starting to bring the community off of the app and into real life, traveling together. So definitely check those out. And as you know, Pangea sort of co-hosts Nomad Week with you and with Work Wanderers. So hopefully we see a lot of the listeners in Cape Town in February of 2027.
Yeah, and a great networking opportunity as well for everyone to come meet us in person and learn more about Pangea and Nomad Week.
Totally.
For sure. Well, thank you so much, Matt. Really appreciate your time. And that's all from me today on Corp Radio. This is the Business Exchange with Andrae Smith, and I'll see you next time.